We've got, I think, a really good lineup tonight. We're trying a little different format. If you were here last time, you saw we started with announcements. We'll still do that. We've got a great presentation on using AngularJS for mobile with Ari Lerner. And then we're going to follow up with a couple tech talks, short talks, lightning talks by some of the Angular team members. And we'll ask that you save questions till the end, write them down. We just want to make sure that we can get through these talks in a time where everybody can get home if they want to. All right, well, with no further ado, I'll start with a couple announcements. Cool things that are happening here in December. We did 3 releases, and if you have been following along, we've gone from releasing maybe twice a year to every week, and it's very, very good, we think. So in this last set of 1.22 through 1.24, we closed 91 issues and pull requests. A lot of these were related to animation fixes. Animation is very new for us in Angular, and so you guys are helping us find some of the edge cases, and thank you very much. And then some other highlights are that we improved performance in a couple places. One bit for data binding. You'll probably see it if you've got a large app, you'll see some improvement. And then for the expressions as well. We also did a release for Angular Dart. Angular Dart is not quite at the 1.0 state, and so we're still experimenting with some of the APIs. But we're moving on pretty quickly. We're still building out the expressions. So we've just added the ternary operator and integer division in the expressions. We've done a lot of improvements for performance, and you can see a bunch of them there, including one thing that's experimental support for a directive we're calling ng shallow repeat, which is it's a performance enhancement in the case where you think I've got a collection where it's not going to expand. You can try it out. You can tell us if you like it. This will be a big determining factor on whether we like it or not. We've also started publishing our internal meeting notes, so you guys can follow along and tell us or have a better idea about what we're working on and give us feedback earlier maybe than by just seeing releases come out. We've got a link to this, and by the way, there'll be a link to this entire deck at the end if you want to see where this is. I also publish these things on Google+ and Twitter. One interesting framework on top of Angular to note, if you're doing mobile apps or if you're thinking of doing mobile apps, as we're talking about tonight, there's this cool thing that's in alpha right now called the Ionic Framework. Go check them out. It looks like the missing piece is kind of an equivalent of Bootstrap plus some additional things you might need to round out the rest of your application, whether you're building a regular web app for mobile or something delivered through something like PhoneGap or Titanium. Our guest tonight, Ari, has built this cool thing called 25 Days of Angular. I assure you it's non-denominational, but there's tips that you can come back every day to learn something cool about Angular. And then the last thing I'd like to plug for a webcast we're going to do later this week on building Chrome apps with AngularJS. And you can catch that on Thursday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific time. There's a link to this. I will tweet this out and share on Google+ after this meeting. And then I'll ask you to help me welcome Ari from who's going to present on using Angular to build mobile web apps. All right, when you plug in there, just go ahead and hit that one there.
Okay. There it is. Cool. Yeah, can you guys hear me? Can you hear me through the mic? Can you hear me not through the mic? Just kidding, that's silly. All right. All right. Okay, so before we get this talk started, today I'm trying, see, I think I have it over here. Cool. So before we get this talk started, I'm trying a piece of Angular software called CrowdSound. We tried this yesterday and it worked. It was awesome yesterday. So if you are interested in participating and asking questions that we'll get to at the end of the talk, feel free to sign up for CrowdSound. I don't think you actually have to sign up. Just go to crowd.so/a user. Cool. And let's log out of that too. Awesome. All right, with that, let's get started. Today we're going to talk about building mobile web apps with Angular. Before we do that, oh, I forgot I just added this. This is the URL. If you do want to go and participate on crowd.so, we'll see it. And as I said, at the end of the talks, we'll answer those questions. So now, before we get started, a little bit about me. I'm Ari Lerner. I co-founded a small consulting shop based out of San Francisco called fullstack.io. I'm the author of NG Book. I'm also the author and curator of NG Newsletter. I co-authored a couple other books, as you can see there. I teach Angular along with JavaScript at a local programming school in San Francisco called Hack Reactor, and I volunteer for a couple others. And my background is primarily in systems architecture and distributed systems. And now I'm going to try the remote. Oh, it worked. Okay, cool. So let's build a mobile app. Oh, I thought I logged out of you. I guess I did not. All right. The Chrome version. All right. So what we're going to talk about today is turning our desktop app, this beautiful desktop app that combines the Facebook APIs with Groupon APIs that we've built. We've intentionally built this for the desktop. In this talk, we're going to talk about how to convert our application into a mobile app. So as I previously mentioned, this takes my Facebook friends. I can scroll through them. Oops. I can scroll through my Facebook friends like this, and I can say, hey, Zach, I want to send you a Groupon deal. So it combines the Facebook API with Groupon like that. Awesome. And Zach is a cool guy, by the way. All right. So the challenges that we face when we're building, I'm totally in front of that thing. The challenges that we face when we're building mobile web apps is the fact that our users are really well trained for what a mobile app experience should look like. They expect native-like reactivity. They expect native-like speed. They also expect it to be really easy and quick. So when we're building a mobile web app, things that we have to battle, things that we have to account for are things like the fact that we have so much device fragmentation. There's so many devices out there. How do we design for all of those? And how do we deliver experiences that we know will work on one, as well as wanting them to work at least somewhat decently on another? For instance, if there's hardware acceleration on the iPhone, iOS 4 and up, but there's not hardware acceleration on Android 2.3, that type of thing. And also, as I previously mentioned, our users expect a beautiful experience, so we have to deal with CSS and what our applications look like. So let's get started. Let's start thinking mobile. The first thing that I do when I think about building a mobile app is I look at what the user experience is going to be like. And the first interaction that our users have with our mobile apps is how fast they load. So there's a really fantastic blog post by Ilya Grigorik, I think that's how you say his name, that talks about if your mobile app is not delivered within 300 milliseconds, your user thinks there's something wrong, and if it's not delivered within 1 second, they would probably think it's broken. So you lose a lot of users if you don't get the immediate feedback. So things that we can do so the trick is to make our applications appear that they're fast. They don't necessarily have to be super fast, especially if you have a lot of files to download, before your application boots. They just have to appear like they're fast. So one of the tricks that you can get around, showing our users that our applications are actually working is by using a splash screen. We call this time to pixel. We want to minimize the time to pixel as fast as possible. And based on how browsers work, we can do this actually really easily. When our browsers fetch our HTML, what they're doing is they'll get all the data and they'll start parsing it, and then they'll run through and start rendering the view as soon as it sees a node and it applies those styles to those nodes. So what we can do is we can take out everything that we need to load at the top out of the head element, and we can push up what we want the user to see immediately right to the top of the body. So in this case, in the sample code, you can see that we have nothing in the head element. We only have like the title in the head element. Actually, you can't even see the head element because there's a comment in there. But there's nothing in the head element other than a title, and then we get immediately down to our splash screen. So the first thing that the browser is going to see is that splash screen. Oh, and also inline styles, so we can actually style that splash screen. You don't want your application to have to load anything while it's showing the splash screen. By the way, I will mention this the entire talk. As much as we can minimize network requests, the faster our applications will work and the better experience our users will have. So it's important that especially when we're building a splash screen, we don't have it load anything. As I mentioned before, we'll want to inline those styles, so these styles can sit in the head element, which is where they appropriately should sit. And in order, after our application is ready to go and our application is bootstrapping, we want that splash screen to go away, and we want our application to show up. Well, there is a directive inside of Angular called ngcloak, and ngcloak's responsibility is to show content after the application has been loaded. We can use this we can invert that and use it to show our splash screen, and then when the application loads, we don't actually have to do anything to hide our splash screen, because as long as we apply our ngcloak directive to that element, ngcloak will naturally hide it using this type of style sheet. All right, so I kind of mentioned it just a bit. Reduce the number of network requests as possible, and only send the information that the mobile app needs. So how many of you here know about the media tag in a link element? Yeah. Okay. How many of you here know that the browser will download it regardless of the media tag? Yeah. Right. So the way that this works is the browser will download this file regardless if it's on a mobile or tablet or a desktop, and it will only apply the styles after. So how do we only send that file if we want it? If we only want it for our mobile app? Well, we have to use something like, currently right now we have to use JavaScript. So in this case, we could do something like this, where we put a data media tag, and then we run some JavaScript that looks kind of like this. It's not really that pretty. That only applies those media tags if the browser we're actually looking at matches the media of the screen that is trying to request the content. You could do something like that, and it's really kind of ugly. You could also do it using Angular, using Angular's ngIf tag. One caveat to this is you can't use this method if your application requires it, requires that style to be applied for the first screen that your user sees, because your Angular app, if you're using the splash screen, your Angular app won't have bootstrapped with enough time for your styles to come down, so your browser can render it. So any styles that your first screen needs should use either the other tag or inline those styles. Okay, so CSS images. How many of you guys here are using media queries? Yep. How many of you guys here who raised your hands just now? Well, first off, if you didn't raise your hands, you should be using media queries for building mobile apps. Second, how many of you who just raised your hand have done something like this before? If you're not raising your hand, you haven't used media queries. because so what this is saying for mobile phones, I only want to download the small ducks image, but for everything else, I want to download the ducks image. The problem with this is that the browser will will download both of those images regardless of the screen, because what the browser will later say, hey, the page element needs only the small ducks, but it will still take both those files, and that causes unnecessary network requests that slow our application down. So the proper way to do that for using media queries is to start thinking mobile first. A lot of people, they use the term think mobile first or mobile first. What that means when we're talking about CSS is use media queries everywhere. The browser in this case, the mobile phone will only download one image, and the desktop will also only download one image in this case. Okay, so I've mentioned a few times we want to reduce the latency of our application as much as possible. Ways that we can do that is we can minimize the payload size we can minimize the number of bytes that get sent down to our devices. With JavaScript, we have tools like Uglify and YUI compressor. But when we try to excuse me, I forgot to mention, I'm a little sick today, so I might cough into the microphone. Cover your ears if that happens. Good timing. All right, so if we minimize our Angular apps, our Angular app ends up looking something like this. Whereas in the unminified, oh, it's really far away. I'm totally going to use a laser pointer. I'm excited about this. When we use our unminified code, we're trying to inject the scope into our controller like that. But when we go minified, the scope ends up looking like E. And then if you're not taking this into account when you're minifying your code, you're going to get this weird error that says E provider not found. You're like, WTF, mate? I don't know what that means. So there's ways to get around this to minify our JavaScript code, and one of those solutions is by using, or the solution is by using the. That's not true. There are multiple ways to do this. This is the preferred way to do it, which is using the bracket notation, where we can, in a string, tell the Angular object what we want to inject, because minifiers do not minify strings. This is kind of a pain in the butt to constantly type in our Angular apps, and causes a little bit of just causes a lot of like extra code and extra lines that we have to type. So we can use tools like ngmin or ngmin to do this automatically for us. Ngmin is a pre-minifier, pre-processor for JavaScript. We can also use the closure compiler using the closure compiler is a Java compiler, which we can use annotations to do this for us. So moving on, it's compressing as much as we possibly can. We can compress our CSS using something like CSSmin or YUI compressor. We can also inline our images. The more we can inline our images, the faster our applications will go. What I mean by that is using the base 64 tag inside of our CSS and putting those images actually inside of the CSS, so when the CSS gets transferred, so does the image. If we can't do that, if our images are too large, that's really good for small images, but not really good for large images. We at least should minimize those images as possible. Also, we only want to deliver scaled images. We don't want to deliver full-size images and let the mobile browser do the manipulation of the sizing manipulation. Also, the browser doesn't care about white space, so we should strip out as much white space as possible to deliver, again, smaller code to the browsers. Also, it's common practice today. It's common practice to concatenate all the files you possibly can that belong together. The reason for this is, again, we want to reduce the number of network calls. I'll say that as I said, I'll say that this entire talk. Calling that out for just a second. Anytime that we make a network call, depending on the location of that network call, it might cause two requests. One to a DNS server, and then one to make the actual data request. And that's a lot of latency for our users to experience. This will change with Speedy and HTTP2, which is HTTP2. So there is good news. The Yeoman tool itself sets up pretty much everything that I just described for you, with the exception of, actually I lied. It sets all this up for you by default, so use the Angular generator. It is awesome. Okay, so let's talk about deferring JavaScript execution. As the browser is parsing the DOM, it will run JavaScript if there's JavaScript inline in the browser. It will run that JavaScript. So if that JavaScript, for instance, is calling out to get another file, like a document write, and it's creating a script tag, it's going to run that JavaScript and then execute that JavaScript and then manipulate the DOM at the same time. So we want to defer that JavaScript execution. That will slow the user down, by the way. We want to defer that execution until the DOM is ready. So if we're not using Angular, for anything that is non-Angular specific in JavaScript, we can either use, you're probably familiar with the jQuery document ready function. This is the non-jQuery version of that. If we're doing something in Angular that we need to run at the top, we can use the run function. The run function in Angular is kind of like the main method, and will run before anything else inside of our Angular app runs. So this is a good spot to run any Angular specific code or non-Angular specific code. All right, so one trick that we've built inside of our Angular apps is by using promises to load services. So for instance, in this, it's the other way. There we go. So in this application, in our desktop application, what we're doing is we're relying on two services. We're relying on the Facebook service and we're relying on the Groupon service. In order to use the Facebook service, we have to use we're writing a script out to the document that says, hey, go get the latest Facebook JavaScript version. One way that you could bootstrap your app and guarantee that that Facebook service is available is by using the Facebook async init to bootstrap our Angular app. Only issue with doing that is then even further defers the time that it takes to get our Angular app to show up on screen for our users. So a quicker way to do that, can't really see the top. Oh well. A quicker way to do that for our users is to wrap that script loading into an Angular provider, which will handle taking care of loading that script in the background, so that our Angular app can continue to bootstrap and our application can start to run even though it doesn't have the libraries yet to actually run. So with this service, this specific service, which by the way, these slides will be made available and the sample app will be made available, I'm told. So you guys will see all this code in context. What this allows us to do is instead of needing to say hopefully that Facebook element is there or wait, we can call fbservice.then, and anywhere that we want to call the Facebook service in this example, anywhere that we want to call that, we can resolve that with this promise and say when this guy comes back, then execute this code. So all throughout the services that we use, our services use something like this so that we can guarantee that that Facebook code is there. And our application's bootstrapped just as though we weren't waiting for another service. Also, another common practice is don't use import in CSS. Import potentially could cause another network call or two, which would further slow it down, so don't use it. The preferred way to do it if you need to have multiple style sheets is use two link tags. The one exception to this rule is the fact that if you're using Sass will inline all those imports for you. So if you're using the Yeoman generator, then you can use import and not feel bad about it. Another trick to speeding up our application loading is by using sprite images. And sprite images, if you're not familiar, is basically taking all our small images and putting them on a single image, and then using CSS itself to locate that image and the size of that image to show those images up. This way, you only have to send one image for all your tiny images, for your thumbs up and your smiley faces. And there are tools to help us do this. A really good one called Glue is a really good one. There's also Google's page speed service, which is basically a proxy, will do this for you. So you want to use that. Another way that we can speed up our applications for mobile users is by using local storage, especially if our users are coming back to our application and that data is already ready and already available to us or to them. It's also good for if the network loses connection. For instance, if they're a passenger in a car, they're not driving. If they're a passenger in a car that's going through a tunnel, then they'll lose network. That's just how physics works. So using local storage is a really good way to sync between your mobile apps and external apps. As you can see, this is an example of how to use local storage right down here. So one of the tricks to using local storage is knowing when to expire that local storage and when to end up having to refresh. You can create these. You can create that functionality for yourself. You will have to create that functionality for yourself based on what type of application you're running. There are tools out there that can help us do that for us. Angular Cache is a particularly good one that we use often. That allows us to expire that cache on over a specific amount of time. So if your application is time-based, Angular Cache is a good option. Okay, so now let's leave the latency topic for a bit and go to the design. The HTML viewport. If you are building a mobile app, it's important that you use the HTML viewport tag. It's the meta tag. If you're not familiar with the meta tag, there's tons and tons of documentation on it. This allows us to control the screen. It allows us to control what our users can do. It allows us to give our users the ability to zoom in or not zoom in, that type of stuff. It is really important when building mobile apps. Another trick, also, if you can get away with it, use SVG fonts rather than loading fonts from an external source. The reason is because a little bit bigger of a file is better than making a network request. So SVG fonts will go really fast. Also, when talking about design, there are tons of CSS frameworks and JavaScript frameworks that enable us to build JavaScript apps that look like native apps. These are a few. The actual application that you guys will be getting or that will be made available to you is written in Ratchet. One of the issues with this is, how many of you guys have tried to use any of those frameworks that we listed? Yeah? One of the toughest issues with that is integrating with our JavaScript, if there is JavaScript there. Because that JavaScript likely, unless it's an Angular shim or an Angular directive, it probably doesn't know about Angular, and we have to hack our way around that. So my best advice for you when trying out one of those frameworks is either try to use one of the libraries that doesn't require jQuery, because that will just make your life way easier when trying to integrate with Angular. Also, look into the source of the JavaScript code. It's likely not that difficult to understand. And if no one else has written it, write a directive for it so that you can use the proper Angular way of interacting with your mobile app. Yeah. Okay. So custom actions for different viewports. Sometimes we want something to show up on. Something to show up on a mobile app that we don't want to show up on a desktop app, and vice versa. How can we do that? Well, we can use something called Modernizer. Modernizer provides an awesome touch Boolean when it loads up. It can tell us whether or not we're on a touch screen or we're not on a touch screen. When we're building mobile apps, we use this in conjunction with a service or a provider, where we set whether or not the app is a touch app or it's not a touch app. And using that provider, we can use our config function that boots. When our config function runs, it will set whether or not it's a touch device or not. And then anywhere in our application, we can say if it's a touch app, then do this. If it's not a touch app, don't do this. Okay, so let's talk about animations. Animations are a way to make our application more exciting, more interactive, and feel a lot more like a mobile app. One of the biggest things that I can impart on you guys is use CSS animations. They're built in, they're fast. JavaScript animations are not fast, and you absolutely do not want to run a digest inside of a JavaScript animation. So if you're trying to do anything with, well, I don't know why, if you are running a digest inside of an animation, you're probably doing something wrong, so don't do that. But prefer CSS animations over JavaScript animations. And those are actually surprisingly easy to do. This, by the way, is Sass, not CSS, although it does compile to CSS and looks very similar to it. This is how you'd build an animation in the latest version of Angular. The latest version of Angular will, anytime that something is shown, like if the ng show flips over and it hides something, then it'll add classes called ng-enter, ng-enter, and ng-leave to allow us to add animations to that. It's actually really cool. I highly recommend using it. Also, sliding between pages, which we'll see in the final version of our application. This is one way that we can control how our pages animate when they slide back and forth. Is by setting an animation.pageDirection class, and anytime that we change the direction or we change our view, we can look at it and say, hey, are we going left or are we going right? And then inside of our DOM, we would apply it something like this. So anytime that we're going left, that ng class will resolve to a left, and anytime we're going right, that ng class will resolve to right, and our animation will be applied. Okay, so what about non-hardware accelerated devices? How do we work with those? Well, I would say use Modernizer. Modernizer will add a polyfill that will enable us to still be able to provide those CSS animations to non-hardware accelerated devices, albeit they'll probably be very slow. All right, so now let's pretend that we're actually a mobile app. Inside of a mobile app, we want to provide touches. We want to provide swipes so that when our users change a view, they can swipe side by side. It's very different from pressing the left and the right key on the desktop. The latest version of Angular, with the latest version of Angular, we can use Angular Touch. I think it's actually 1.1.5, but the team probably would know better than I. Regardless, we can use ng Touch, which is a package that gives us the ability to have two new directives called ng swipe left and ng swipe right. And these ng swipes, what they're doing is they're replacing the click element. So this only works, and this swipe left and swipe right only works if we're using ng click, or we are in an element with an ng click in there. And this is how you'd animate that. All right, so other options. I mentioned a little bit that ng click overwrites the ng click tag, and also only provides ng swipe left and ng swipe right. Sometimes that is not enough for us. So using something like Hammer.js, which is a really mature JavaScript library that enables us to do a lot of things like double clicking and swiping and pinching and things like that. We can use Angular gestures, which is a thin wrapper around Hammer.js to provide other interactions with our users. Also, if we want to have a carousel in our app, when you're sliding between images in a gallery, you can use Angular Carousel. Angular Carousel is great. I highly recommend it. You can use Angular Snap. Angular Snap is does exactly what it sounds like, where you slide, and then if you let go in the middle of it, it'll snap over to the next view. Very cool and provides some nice interactivity. So when we're talking about mobile apps, back to the actual devices, one of the things we have to pay attention to is the fact that our DOM is parsed a lot slower than it is in our desktop app. So we'll need to take extra care about how we interact with our DOM and optimizations that we need to provide so that our applications run snappy on these devices. So we have to have that sensitivity for the DOM. So let's talk about some Angular optimizations that we can do in our Angular apps. One of the things we can do is limit the filters in our view. How many of you guys using Angular have used a filter in a view like this? Yep. If you've used Angular before and you're not raising your hand, I think you're not listening. So one of the problems with this, and this is in the current version of Angular. I mentioned it briefly. The next version of Angular, this is an optimization that I know the team is working on. In the current version of Angular, if you're putting a filter in the view like this, then every single time there's a digest run, that filter is going to run. So this is particularly bad if you're using ng repeat and filters and multiple filters, or even just a single filter. That filter will run every single time. So it's preferable if your filter data is not going to change. For instance, this birth date is not going to change. Instead of putting it in the view like this, we can attach it to the element that we're repeating over. So this is how you access a filter inside of a controller using the filter service. For instance, we're providing in our data, we're providing a formatted date, and we're also ordering the lists of our friends using the order by filter in here. Other things that we can do, that we have to do, is watch the number of watches. We have to limit the number of watches, because watching the number of watches feels like very matrixy. So limiting the number of watches will help optimize our app for sure. It's well established that the number of watches on the screen correlates to the performance, and this is both desktop and mobile. So the less number of watches that we have on our screen, the faster our applications will feel, and the faster our applications will respond. So inside of this app, my friend Shira, her name is not likely to change, and her image is not likely to change. So this is what we call static information. Brendan's name is not going to change. Jesse's not going to Jesse's name is not going to change. That type of stuff. So we can use a tool like bind once, which is a tool that will allow us to use Angular as though we're using the natural way that Angular works, but only but removing the watch after that information is placed in the DOM. So bind once looks like this. It looks very similar to not using bind once, just using regular Angular. The difference is that we have these BO tags in here, like this, like BO source and BO href. What that's doing is it's setting up that watch one time. When that watch is resolved, then it's calling the unbind function. So we no longer have watches for all those elements. This is really good, especially when using ng repeat. Another way that we can make a better, more responsive application is by using paging. So I think I have 1,200 friends. We were talking about this before. I think I have 1,200 friends in my Facebook list. First off, 1,200 friends on this little device is way too much information to put up. Also, even on my desktop, that's way too much information to put up. So paging is a good idea whenever you're doing anything with lots of data. Inside of the app, we use paging like this, where we're fetching based on a limit and an offset from the Facebook API. And then anytime that we need to get more data, we can do it by just updating those components. All right, so inside of our mobile browsers, every single mobile browser, to my knowledge, implements this thing that we call slow click. I don't know if it has an official name, but that what it does is it adds a 300 millisecond delay anytime an event happens in the browser. And this delay is intentional because it allows the browser to see if we're double clicking, or if we're swiping, or if we're swiping or we're sliding, that type of thing. Problem is that when we're trying to build an app that we're trying to build an app that we want to reflect the native app performance, this definitely causes a problem. So we can kind of get rid of this using ng-touch. ng-touch itself does help get rid of this. I mentioned before it only works with ng-click. We can use another tool called fast-click, this is what we prefer, which is a really well battle-tested JavaScript library that will attach to those events, or will attach to the document and allow those clicks to get fired immediately. And it's super easy to implement with Angular, as you can see in the run function. Okay, talking about network performance. Network performance is it's inevitable that our mobile app has to be delivered over the network. So how can we best both minimize the amount of data that's getting sent over? We've talked a lot about that in the beginning of this talk. And also, how can we engage that? How can we engage our radios on these devices as little as possible, or to both save battery life and save performance of our application? So one of the ways that we can do that is we can batch our network calls. This is particularly good if we're doing things like if we're queuing up a network call. For instance, if we want to preload the next page of our Facebook friends, we can queue up this network call so that any other network call that we need to make, they can run at the same time, engage the radio at the same time, and then when they come back, the radio can then, or the OS can then take care of putting that radio back to sleep. We would end up using it something like this, where we queue up our call inside of our something like our factory, our account factory. Another thing that we can do is preload our Angular templates. So the way the Angular templating works is it uses Ajax to go fetch the template, and it stores whatever it gets from that template back into a cache factory, back into a cache. Once that if that template is requested again, rather than going to the network, it uses that cache, and it uses what's in the cache as the view, as the template. We can fake that. We can use that to our advantage by pre-nesting our templates in a JavaScript file that we actually send back to the browser when we're delivering the app. This is really good for first screens, for like first couple screens, the screens that our users see immediately. And it's not so good for screens that our users rarely visit. So for instance, a home page or a dashboard page, this is a really good thing to bundle in our templates. But for account screens that aren't visited very often, it's better to let the network fetch those, because what we want to do, again, we want our app to show up as fast as we possibly can make it show up. So the more data that our device has to fetch, the slower that will be. So we want to be selective about what templates we preload and which ones we don't. All right, this entire talk has been primarily focused around building mobile web apps with Angular. Let's talk real quick. We'll just briefly mention how you can wrap those into native apps. So if you want to deliver your application over in the app stores, you can use something like PhoneGap or Cordova. Also, one of the last pieces of information that I can give you is get to the real device as fast as humanly possible. Build your functionality, test your functionality on your desktop, and get to the mobile devices, again, as fast as humanly possible, on repeat, on repeat, on repeat. You can use things like Chrome, mobile Safari remote debugging, which I'm not hooked up right now. I was going to show you. Or you can use mobile Chrome, depending on the device that you're looking at, which browser you're more comfortable with. Okay, lastly, I wrote a book on Angular. It's 635 some odd pages long, and it's apparently it's awesome from other users, and it's definitely awesome from this author. Anyway, I wrote a book. It's available for pre-release right now. Hopefully it'll be in print for Christmas if you're interested in more information. I've also been told we're taking questions at the end, so. Oh, wait, hold on. Wait, hold on. Where is my mobile app? There it is. Hooray, there it is. You guys see it? So yeah, this is our app on the simulator, which is not really that exciting. But yeah, this is using all the everything that I mentioned in the talk. This is it's the same app. This is Never Forget Birthday at appspot.com, and this is also Never Forget Birthday.apps.appspot.com. It's the same exact app delivered in a mobile optimized way. Cool.
Hello, I'm Jeff from the Angular team. I'm giving what is called a lightning talk, which is covering how to test directives, if I can get plugged in. So the talk is called Testing Tabs because we're testing a directive that is the tabs directive on the Angular homepage. And this is also something that Vojta has put together a standalone repository that has the tab example with unit tests. So why I'm doing a lightning talk on directives is because I think some people are a little bit shy about testing directives or scared of testing directives because it's somewhat complicated. You're testing logic, you're testing views, you're testing multiple things working together. So a lot of people just write apps testing services or controllers and neglecting the directives, which turns into some headache later on. So this is the directive we're going to be working with, and it's the tabs directive that you can find on the angularjs.org homepage. It has two tab panes. One is for showing some localization filters, and the other is for showing pluralization. And we have a US version and a Slovak version. So when thinking about testing directives, there are a few things that are good to think about. What do you want to test? One, you want to test logic. You want to test that the controller or whatever's in the linking function is doing what you expect it to do. So when a method is called in response to a user action and it's given some kind of input, then is it doing what you expect that input and giving the right output? And then you want to test the compilation. When the directive is compiled, is the DOM coming out how you expected it to come out? And lastly, you want to test user event handling. When I click something or when a user does something, is the right thing happening as a result? And so first, in order to set up testing for directives properly, one of the most helpful things is this ng HTML to JS preprocessor. I think Vojta authored this as well. There's an HTML to JS preprocessor that's similar, but this one is for Angular. And what it does is it takes your Angular templates based on whatever path you provide it in your Karma setup, and it caches those so that as you're testing directives with your templates, use a directive that uses an external template, it's already cached and isn't having to fetch that every time that it's tested. So here's how you set it up in KarmaConf, and I'm going to share this afterwards, so you don't have to memorize anything here. You want to load the files in your KarmaConf, and then you want to tell the preprocessor which paths should be made available here. And what this gives you is in your tests, you can just make those available because it creates modules for each of those templates that you can just do a before each, and then the directives will automatically get those templates without having to fetch them as you go. So this reduces a lot of complexity in your code. You don't have to think about asynchronously loading your templates and then making them available to a directive. A lot of things that you would have to do manually if the HTML to JS preprocessor weren't available. So now that we've got it set up, how do we actually write the tests? So one clever trick for testing logic is setting up your controller in a way that you can test it independently and then instantiate it within tests. So here's an example of how I've done it. So when you're writing a directive, you have the controller property that can accept a function or it can accept a string of controller that's already been added to your module. In this case, it assumes that you're taking a reference to another controller inside of your directive so that then I can inject it here and then use the controller service in Angular to ask for that controller by name and create a controller that I can then test in my app. So let's see. So here I'm just using the controller service, telling it what the name of the controller is that's already been added to my module, and then passing it in a scope and a null element. And here's what an assertion could look like. It should mark a given pane as selected. So my controller has a select method that just takes in a pane, and it makes all the other panes have a selected property of false, and this pane to have a selected property of true. So now with just a few lines, I can test that behavior. And the second part is we want to test that we're compiling properly, that when I get the output element from my directive, it looks how I expected it to. Here's an example of how I would write a test to do this. And one important note is, you see I've commented a line here that it appends this element to a DOM. Most of the time when you write tests against directives, you don't actually need to append it to a document. You don't need to see it in context of an application. You can just use the Angular APIs to create an element, compile it with a scope, digest it so the models propagate, and then you can use the Angular element APIs to explore that element and test it and look at values of elements within it. So that saves time and a little bit of complexity, but there are times when you would need to add it to the DOM, like if you need to check the dimensions after it's been added to a page, or position in some cases. But this is a simple example of how you can just create the element, compile it with a scope, and check that the outputted element has at least the structure sort of like you would expect. And the last part is we want to test that user events do what we hope they would do in our directives. So in this case, we see that I've already compiled my element, and I'm looking for the titles, because when I click a title, it should change the pane if I'm not already on that title. So the default is that the first title at index 0 would be the active one. So I want to select the second title, which is at the index 1, find it, and then click it, and then I expect the first title to not have an active class. So with this one line, I can mock a user behavior and see the outcome. And so that covers the sort of unit style testing of directives, but once you have multiple directives working together, you'll want to use something like Protractor, which is an Angular project by Julie Ralph that makes it easy to test a full application using a Selenium WebDriver. The project link is here, but also she's put together a sample project with some sample tests based on end-to-end tests on angularjs.org sites. And here's the repo that Vojta put together. The line numbers I mentioned in the slides are based on this SHA. You can write that down. And then that's it. That's how you test directives. Now, oh, thank you. Now Vojta is going to come talk about debugging.
That looks good. Hi everybody, my name is Vojta, and I want to show you a couple of quick tips or tricks how to make debugging a little bit easier, debugging of your Angular apps. So when your app doesn't work the way you expect it to work, which actually happens to me pretty often, what you really want to do is, you need to get as much information as possible. When you're looking at a blank screen and it doesn't work and you try to guess what's wrong, it's not the most efficient way of debugging. So you wanna pop up a web inspector to see if there is some exceptions. You make sure that you are using non-minified code, like don't use minified AngularJS for debugging, because then your stack traces just doesn't make any sense. And I don't know, I'm pretty sure I could find some other advices like that, but you probably know that. So there's one more thing, and the thing is, there's lots of stuff kind of behind the scene, right? Because when you're looking at your browser, it's kind of visual representation of your app, how it looks. But there's lots of stuff hidden, like all the JavaScript objects. Like in Angular app, that's all the directives and scopes and filters and services and all these objects. You can't see them. But when you are debugging a problem, it would be really helpful to inspect these things. And so all these tricks and tips are basically just how to get behind the scene, how to see, how to inspect these objects. So here is the same example that Jeff was using. It's from Angular homepage, nothing special, tabs component. And let's see. Let's inspect some element. And first cool thing that I want to show you is that in the web inspector, when you select an element, you can do $0. You know that? It will give you the selected element, right? So now I'm selecting head, but if I click on body and I do the same thing, I will get the body element. That has nothing to do with Angular, but it's supported, I think, by most of the browsers. I tried it in Safari, Chrome, and Firefox. It works on all these browsers. I'm not sure about IE, but hopefully it works too. So now let's do something with Angular. Well, what we can do, we can click any element within the app. So let's do, for instance, this is the root element, and we can wrap this element like this. You can do Angular element, which is like jQuery wrapper basically, and you can call injector on it. I will assign it to variable, and this gives me the application injector. And that's really handy because that's basically like entrance to your whole application, right? Because through the injector you can do get, and I don't know, you can get basically, let's get log service, right? And I can inspect it, I can interact with it, I can do anything I want with it. So that gives me access to filters and, I don't know, controllers, all of the services. That's probably the most useful thing. All right. Now there's one thing that you can't get from injector, and that is scopes, right? You can get the root scope, but your app typically consists of many scopes. There is a whole structure of scopes, and so you want to know like what's the scope behind this element to debug, right? And you can't do that with injector. And in fact, I think that's where lots of debugging issues comes from, is where you kind of think that it's this scope and it's some other scope and you run into that scope and whatnot. So let me show you an example of such an issue. This is the template. That's the example I was just showing in the browser. And I added, you can see here, this number is just bound to property age. And I added an input, which is bound, ngModel bound to the same property age. And I added one more down here, and that one is bound to the same property again, right? And in my control and some root controller, I defined this property to number 33. So now if I refresh, you can see I got these three bindings, nothing surprising. If I change this value to, I don't know, let's do 28. You can see they all update because they are all bound to the same variable. Now, the question is, what's going to happen if I interact with the input? Like, what's going to happen if I change the input? Like, who thinks that, let's do a little voting. Who thinks that if I type into the input, only the input value will change and the two other bindings will remain the same? Who thinks that's going to happen? Nobody? Okay. Well, sounds like you are Angular experts. So who thinks that all of them are going to change? I mean, yeah, it kind of makes sense. It's binding. Yeah, that's how it works. So let's say I interact with the input, and so who thinks that all of those bindings will change? And if nobody raises your hand, I can go home because I don't think I can explain anything here. So somebody should raise hand. No, I think there was like 10, 15 people. Thanks. Okay. Anyway, yeah, that's not what's going to happen. Because if I do that, only this one changes. Right? Which is kind of mystery. Not for Angular experts, but for some people. And you know, once we understand what's going on and what's the scope structure, I think it kind of makes sense. So I added a little bit of CSS to demonstrate that. So if you look at these colorful boxes, they kind of mark scopes. So there's like red scope, there's the root scope, and there's like blue scope. There are three green scopes, you know. And here's the trick. What you can do I can, let's inspect this element. It's inside body, but let's say I want to inspect this guy. So that's the kind of root scope. And what I can do, I can again do Angular element and wrap this element, and I can do scope. And that gives me the scope below that element, right? And that is really helpful because now I can check this scope. There's a bunch of private properties, but here is the age 28. So that makes sense. Let's see this guy, this green guy. Again, I can assign this scope, and I see there's no age defined, right? So what's going on here is that this green scope inherits from blue one, and the blue one inherits from red one, and that's why the property is bound, because that's how scopes work. They inherit paratypically. But now, when I interact with this ng model with this input, what it does, it sets the value to the current scope, right? And that's not the root scope. That's the green scope. So if I do this same thing again, show me that scope. You can see that now the value is defined. Hopefully. What? That's a mystery. Now, this is real mystery. Oh, it's here. See, so now it kind of makes sense, but I think it's pretty helpful to, if you have this access to like the model below the elements, and you can see it, because you can also interact with it. So I can change it. I can do scope age equals 45. And you can see that nothing happened, but that's because I did it kind of outside Angular world, and so Angular experts know that you have to do $apply, and then you can see that the view gets updated. All right. So that was basically it. This is the APIs that I showed you. You can do $0, which gives you the currently selected element in the web inspector. It's pretty handy, I think. Then you can wrap it with Angular element and call injector, which gives you the injector of that app. By the way, don't do Angular.injector, because that gives you injector too, but it creates a new injector, so it's not the injector of your app. Then you can do the same thing with scope, and it gives you a scope of below that particular element. And there are two more helpers that I didn't show you, and that's for getting controller. You can pass it ID of a directive, because directive can have controller. So then it will give you the controller of particular directive on the element. And there is one more thing called isolate scope, which is for components with isolate scope. And when you call this API on that element, it will give you this special hidden isolate scope. Cool. One more thing. All these things are nice and handy, but I think it's a lot of typing. So I think what you should rather do is use Batarang. You guys know Batarang? Sorry, what was that? Yeah, I think that's it. It's called Batarang. It's extension for Chrome. You can find it on Chrome Web Store. Brian, I think he's somewhere here. He said that's the famous guy. He did it. It's awesome. So you should install it. And once you install it, in your web inspector, there is an additional tab, AngularJS. And there's a bunch of tabs. I'm not going to go into it, but you can basically inspect the models, and it's much nicer. You can interact with it. You can check out performance of your watchers. You can see all your dependencies, how all the components depend between each other. And I think for me, the most useful thing is that if you go to console and to this elements view, you don't have to type anything, but you can just, when you show this element properties, oops, let's make this bigger. Now when I click on body, you can see on this right side, it automatically shows me the scope. I think that's pretty neat. Because then You know, you just click and you don't have to do anything special. You click on element and it shows you the scope below that element. And also it exports property $scope, which is basically what I showed you before, just shorter version. So check out Battering, and I think that's all. Wait, I need to show you my last slide. Yeah, that's it.
Time for questions. What does it mean? I don't want to answer all the questions then. Mm.
Are the mics down here?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Oops. And please come to the aisles if you have a question, and you can ask over the mic, please.
Can we open the?
Hi there, awesome presentations, by the way. My question is for image performance.
That's for you question, probably.
Oh, for me?
Yeah. Would it be preferred a better method for image performance? Would it be the CSS sprites or using the base 64 embedded elements for your mobile apps?
If you're using, well, it depends on the number of the number of images that you're using. If you're using a ton of images, base 64 is going to your source file is going to explode in size, and so it's better to transfer an image and just use CSS to handle that. If you're transferring less images, then for instance, like if you can possibly get your logo as a base 64 image, that's going to be much better than putting passing it into a sprite.
Thank you.
Sure.
A question is for Ari. So you said for offline performance of your mobile apps, you use local storage. What's your experience of using app cache and to speed up things and
Using what?
application cache?
As in like the Angular cache, or
No, app cache. The HTML5 app cache.
I don't have enough experience to be able to give you. Yeah.
Okay. I guess one more question. Have you, like for ng swipe that you showed, have you done anything where your view would actually track your finger as you swipe? Like ng swipe to the left and swipe to the right just does a transition, but like what about something that kind of mimics the native?
Sure. Angular provides a way for you to use JavaScript rather than just the ng swipe left and ng swipe right to manage your application or your animation. I have done it with that, where I use TweenMax and the JavaScript version of that to actually do the actual sliding. What is your use case for it, if you don't mind me asking?
Essentially a mobile app that kind of lets you swipe, like think of a gallery. Swipe and you see the next pane while you're swiping.
Yeah, you can do that with the native ng swipe left. Just so you know, you can do it like that. You can control the amount of time in between those if you just want that swipe back. But if you want to be able to hold your finger and swipe and then come back to it, then you would have to do that using the JavaScript. Using Angular, you have to use the JavaScript API to manage those. And I've done that, and there's I can share with you how we do that.
Okay.
I don't want to speak for Tobias on our team too much, but this is something he's working a lot on in the ng touch module native support of that exact use case.
And he's awesome, by the way.
This question's for Ari. I remember in your talk you mentioned how you would modularize templates into a bundle and then you'd just load them in one go to sort of minimize the amount of requests. And I'm also thinking about how you'd go about lazy loading like controllers, services, or directives, and if there's currently an Angular strategy to doing that.
Sure. If there's an Angular strategy for that, I mean, I can tell you how we have done it.
Yeah.
Or I can show you how we've done it. If you're talking, I suppose you're talking about pages that aren't viewed very often, and you want to lazy load those services.
Yep.
Yeah, you can definitely do that. The way that I have done that in the past is I'll create its own module. I'll create those pages like the myapp.account as a module and put all the controllers and all the filters and all the functions and the services that are needed for that module in a single module and lazy load that JavaScript file.
Would you use require.js or some other framework for doing that?
I don't particularly like require.js, but that's me. So I wouldn't use require.js. I just use native Angular.
Okay, cool. And one more question. What about WebSockets? Have you explored using WebSockets?
We have. One of the pains in the butt about WebSockets is the what's that called? The heartbeat that exists between the two. Oftentimes that heartbeat, when you're on a mobile app, that heartbeat can get delayed, and that heartbeat, the mobile app thinks that WebSocket is dead because it hasn't actually responded, because either we're on 3G or we're just on a bad connection, and because the latency between the WebSocket and our backend server is so large that it'll resend another heartbeat before the original heartbeat gets back to it. So you have to deal with a lot of that latency and those types of issues. Things that we've done that's been more successful than using WebSockets, and again, this is my experience, has been, yes, you can yell at me, polling. But we've been more successful with polling or using a service like Pusher to do the pushing. Although in HTTP 2 we'll get HTTP push, so we won't have to do that. Let's talk offline. Sure.
Are there any more questions? One right here. Okay, and then over there. Brian, is that mic dead? Why don't you come over here too?
Hello?
Okay,
Oh,
so
I got it.
Hey,
so
Brian.
question for Ari also. Okay. So when you say test for with real devices, what are the representative devices you'd recommend so that you'd get coverage?
Sure.
So
So
I'm thinking in terms of both mobile phones or maybe even tablets.
Sure. So I can answer better on mobile phones. What I like to do, I have an Android 2.3, an Android 4.2, and an iPhone 5 and an iPhone 4 that I test our apps on. The reason is because you get the lowest performance on Android 2.3 and the highest performance on the iPhone 5.
Right.
And then you get the experience between the two. If you can't get those phones, I would say do the extremes, because anything in the middle you'll experience something relative to either one of those.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. And we have one here, but let's answer a question from the crowdsound.io.
So what framework do I recommend for building cross-platform mobile apps? I'll just take that one. Hope you guys don't mind. Okay. I personally like Ratchet. I think Ratchet is, when I'm using CSS and only CSS, I use Ratchet. I've also used Chocolate Chip UI. I've had some trouble with that. And I've tried Ionic, and Ionic looks very promising. So in the future, my answer may change to Ionic, but for the time being, it's Ratchet, and it's awesome. It's really lightweight.
Live question here.
Question for Ari. I noticed that you have some experience working with Rails.
With
Ruby
what?
on Rails. You have some experience working with Ruby on Rails.
Yeah.
How well does the preprocessor for minification and uglification work out of the box for the topics that you were talking about earlier about performance related to does it work well, or should I just steer clear of it?
You're using the asset pipeline with Rails?
Yes.
Yeah. You can use ngmin with that asset pipeline.
Okay.
Out of the box, it does not work well. Using ngmin, thank you, Brian, for taking care of that. You wrote ngmin, right?
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah. Okay. There's a Rails or there's a Ruby gem that allows you to use ngmin alongside the asset pipeline.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Cool. Let's do another one from the crowd sound, and then we'll get a live question over here.
You guys should take one now.
Maybe Igor could do the "Can I monitor the frame rate" digest loop.
Ooh. I haven't thought about this one. You can definitely use the web developer tools in Chrome and Safari to monitor the frame rate. What we're doing right now, we're actually building instrumentation into Angular, so you will see events that happen in the framework in the timeline, and in other tools. There is a web tracing framework that we are very happy about. This is coming, but it's not ready yet. So for now, you can just use the default tools that you have. There's awesome flame chart. There's the timeline in Web Inspector, so I would rely on those.
Cool. Live question right here. Oh, sorry, over there, and then over here.
All right, I have a debugging question, so I guess for Vojta. So something that I know has been built into Chrome, I think relatively recently, is the flame charts. And I have not been able to figure out how to make the most sense of them alongside Angular. Does anybody have any tips and tricks for really leveraging flame charts without kind of focusing in on that machinery, the underlying machinery of Angular, but really focusing on the application built on top of it?
I think that's a good question. That's a good request. Let's try it offline. Like,
so this is
I can definitely show you how to use flame charts, but I'm pretty sure you know that. But I think you're asking for like how to see what is actually my code slow and what, because it's kind of inside the Angular calls, so it's gonna be
exactly. Yeah, I think battering probably provides for a lot of that, but I've been curious what flame charts might grow into.
Let's try it. I mean, battering gives you like list of your watchers, and it gives you like some numbers, how much time you spend executing each watcher. So that's really helpful, because I think when you care about performance, the watchers are probably the most important thing. Okay. But let's try with the flame chart.
Okay.
Let's see.
Good, Jeff. Thanks.
Great. Let's do one over here.
Hey, thanks, guys. One comment to Ari's proposed solution for batching all the network calls. I think that's pretty cool. I think we're gonna use that one. But a question for the general Angular community: we have a bunch of partials, and we make a lot of network calls in there. But in the meantime, if the user moves to a different page or clicks on a button, what is the best practice to kill all these HTTP AJAX calls that are going on? Maybe timeout functions that are running. I know there is a cure or defer, and I can resolve that, but is there like a best practice where you collect them all and kill them all on route change? That's it.
So are you asking if it makes sense to abort the request to fetch a template? Is that a question?
Oh, no, just, I mean, let's say I'm making a bunch of AJAX calls when the page loads, and so one of them comes back, there's a search box, the user searches and he gets the result and he clicks on it, all those AJAX queries that are running on the page, right? I mean, on the next page, I don't need them anymore. So I want to cancel them on route change, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and this seems to be happening. I mean, they get to that, they look at it, they go, oh yeah, that's what I wanted. Let me go do something else, maybe go to a debug tab or something.
One of the additions to Angular 1.2 was ability to cancel HTTP requests using the timeout API.
Exactly.
So you can use that to register interest in knowing about the result of the HTTP call. Right. There are some plugins that I've seen, debounce, that help you just debounce HTTP requests. So that can be improvement in this case. But really the HTTP timeout API is the best way to abort the HTTP request.
Right, I mean, that's what I'm using actually. So, we get the $cure or defer in the beginning, and in the timeout, I do a promise on that. But I mean, there's, probably multiple places where all these calls are getting made. So is there like a centralized place where the route changes, so like a route change start or success where I can give it a collection of all these cure or defers and say, cancel all of them, because users not interested in them anymore.
There isn't yet.
Okay.
There is route change event, right?
Yeah, there is route change.
Route
So
change
you can
event,
listen on route change event, but you would have to manually cancel all the requests. So you have to keep track of all the pending requests and cancel them. So you can do it. This is a good suggestion for Angular. Like, we should be able to take care of this for you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, something that was, in Ari's talk, where you group all these calls and you batch them, right? At the same time, you can, and there was a collection, there was an array. So if you could just write it and say on route change, just kill all the previous promises.
Yeah, so I was just gonna say, in the meantime, you can use a service like that.
Exactly. So, okay, cool. Thanks, guys.
Okay, let's go to another one up on the board here. And here's a number 3. Igor, you can talk about this 2,000 limit meme that got started and we can't kill.
So the watch limit is 2,000. I don't know how we got to this number. I don't think it makes sense to...
Actually, Mishko said it sometime. It's his fault.
Mishko says many things.
Yes, he does.
I don't think we have a number for desktop versus mobile, because the number changes depending on the complexity of watches. This is something that we are working on right now to improve the performance of the dice loop and evaluation of the expressions. And the Object Observe API in the browser is going to help a lot with this. So we are not going to be talking about 2,000 or 20,000 or 200,000 in the near future.
But how should people think about it? Like, how would you model in your mind, what should I do if I'm on mobile and I'm looking for watches that might cause
on
slowness?
mobile, you have much smaller real estate than what you have on the desktop. So you wouldn't use the same number of UI elements as you would do on desktop. So you naturally scale down the number of watches just by how you design the mobile user interface. So the best advice I can give you is just design the user interface for mobile device. Don't try to build a desktop app that runs on a mobile. Build a mobile app with a mobile interface, and you will naturally scale down the number of watches and the complexity of the app.
Cool. Okay, Brian over there.
Hi, this question is more for probably Ari. Did you, in using PhoneGap, did you find any surprises? And the reason why I'm asking that is, obviously it's a lot easier to develop, around mobile Safari or mobile Chrome, and then move it to PhoneGap a little later. And I recently found something that surprised me, where it took a lot longer for Angular to start processing, to start compiling Gap than on mobile Safari when it was fetching the files from a server. And then it turned out that mobile Safari was busy caching the files, whereas PhoneGap wouldn't. I mean, are there any gotchas or tips that you might suggest in moving from mobile browsers to PhoneGap?
Sure. I can actually answer for PhoneGap. I can answer for Cordova, which is slightly different. Yes, the browser is an isolated browser inside of Cordova, as opposed to the browser which is the mobile browser on just the natural OS. Actually, send me an email and I'll just send you our source for not a client app. It's supposed to be a joke, but I guess I won't send you the source to a client app who paid me to write that app.
Okay, back to the screen behind us. Jeff.
I'm not always that great.
Where was the HTML to JS used on your directive tests?
It was used, oh, thank you. So the only place in the actual tests that I had to do anything related to HTML to JS was in that before each, where I load a module with the path to each of the templates I loaded. What that does is it puts the templates that I had configured in my Karma config in the template cache, so that when in each of the tests that compiles the template, when it fetches that template, it takes it from the cache instead of loading it asynchronously. If I would have removed those before eaches, you would have seen an error in the terminal that says unexpected GET request to this template path, because Angular would have tried to fetch the template
So all I had to do for the directive to know where that template was use that before each where I require those two modules.
And go up one. Sorry, I missed it. What is the best Angular way to set focus to an element? There's a specific example.
Protractor would be the best answer. So when you're trying to pretend, when you're trying to test a real user interaction, protractor is your best bet. You can do these things through JavaScript, but it turns out to be pretty nasty. So
I don't think this is in the test context.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's probably more question like in production.
I think they want to set keyboard focus.
Oh.
Well, I mean, there is DOM API, right? Like dot focus, so that's what I would use. But I guess the issue is there's some kind of issue with ng repeat. Is the
you can so in the repeater you can just grab get hold of the $index to know what index is your element of, and then whatever you want to do, if you want to set the focus on the first one or the last one, you can just check if you are that element and then place the focus using using DOM APIs. Or you can build a directive that will do it for you, and you can just have like ng focus. Actually, ng focus is built in, so you can just do ng focus and equals $index equals whatever the index should be of the focused element. So that is probably the easiest way.
Cool. Do we have any more? Can you scroll down? I think somebody wants a free copy of Ari's book.
There's one I think about lazy.
That's definitely Angular T-shirt worth a question. I think.
Require.js integration.
Yeah, we can answer that.
Require.js. Is there a timeline for the Require.js integration with Angular mentioned at a previous meetup?
I think we are pretty good at time estimations in general.
I'll answer it. No.
We have some experiments in the works, but it's not production ready.
Okay, great. Are there any more questions in the audience? Great. Thanks, everybody.
There's
one
more question.
One more. Come on up.
For Ari, you said something about using an SVG font on local storage for speed. Can you explain that, please?
Yeah, download. You can either use something like Illustrator to convert a font into SVG. And SVG effectively will just be a bunch of paths. And you can load those paths as a file. And you can send those down alongside everything else. You can send that, like, you can send those strings. They're effectively just strings that say, this is what an A looks like. So just send those strings inside. You can either do it inside of your CSS, or you can do it inside of JavaScript that gets referenced by your CSS. So then what that will do is it'll save the network call later when it says, oh, we're using this font, like from the Google fonts. And by the way, I think fonts.google.com allows you to download as SVG. I could be wrong on that. I'm pretty sure it does.
Another last question. Okay, great. We're a wrap for tonight. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Happy holidays. We'll see you next year.